An exceptionally good afternoon is wished for each one of you. We are exceptionally glad you are here today to hear a presentation by Logan Davis on Christian nationalism and how it can negatively impact Woodland Park and democracy. This will be followed by a question and answer session as Logan will answer any and all questions about this issue. My name is Rodney Noel Saunders. I had to look at my notes to make sure. I am a retired United Methodist pastor. I will be the moderator for this event. The organizers of this event and me request that at all times, all present be respectful of the speaker, and that at all times each person who asks the question be as kindly civil as possible while demonstrating complete and total respect for all other persons here today. We thank you for your help in ensuring this is the most appropriate experience for everyone present. Please keep your questions to 1 minute or less. There's a second hand on that clock, and I'll be watching it. Logan M. Davis is a progressive researcher and writer based in Denver, specializing in the threat posed by right-wing extremism. He is also a political communications consultant. He is a proud member of the Denver News Guild and co-founder of the Political Workers Guild of Colorado, which is the first and apparently only such guild for political workers in America. He was born and raised in Tennessee and spent about a decade running political campaigns. His writings regularly appear in the Colorado Times Reporter, and a new one was just published on January 31st about this issue on which we focus today. Copies are available on the table where some drinks and refreshments are to be found. His published articles include the groundbreaking 7-part series focused on the political landscape in Woodland Park that was finished late in 2023. Looks like we're having technical difficulties with the door. What makes his writings so relevant and importantly significant for this day and time in our history is that they are authentically fact and truth-based as a result of the deep dive, extensive research that he does. I've already said more about him than he once said. So here is Logan M. Davis.
Thank you, Rob. Three here. I'm sorry y'all didn't have anything better to do on a Friday. I appreciate y'all coming out. I appreciate our friends from Karis coming out. Thank you all for being here. If we can't have these discussions, then what are we doing, right? Like Rodney said, I am a writer, former political animal, sort of current political animal, and I've spent the last several years as a researcher, both for public consumption and not public consumption, doing research on political movements, causes, things of that nature. Oh, bullshit. I will do my best to project more. These issues, starting with things like QAnon and other things like that, as we started down a broader conspiracy path sort of as a society a number of years ago, caught my interest and retained significantly more of my interest than standard electoral politics did. So I ended up carving out a different niche, and that is the road that sort of led me here. I'll also say, it's not part of my prepared remarks for our Karis friends here, I didn't come here to talk about you, but there's not a lot in my remarks about y'all. Happy to answer any questions and address anything, but I've certainly not come to cast aspersions on y'all. I'm happy to see you in person. I've spoken to many graduates. I have not seen any actual current Karis folks, so I'm glad to do that. And Mr. Harris, thank you for showing up. Glad we got some of the big wigs in the house. So I will now, just think, I did publish a column the other day. The trick is that I sat down and wrote my remarks for this evening, and then my editor wanted a column for this week. So I turned it into a column. So it is more or less the thing that is printed back there, but I wrote it for y'all and then published it for an audience. So we will dive into that. I'm not going to pontificate for long. I think this will probably take 15 minutes, and then we'll move on to the, what is the Festivus, the sharing of grievances? There it is. The airing of grievances. Wonderful. I got a lot of problems with you people, right? All right. So I was, in fact, raised to take over the world for God. My teachers have been sorely disappointed. It's not something I spend a lot of time thinking about. This is not an identity I walk around with, like, oh, I'm a former church kid, things like that. It's not something I spend a lot of time thinking about. So it's not something I spend a lot of time talking about. I was raised in Nashville, Tennessee, as the son of a Presbyterian minister. Between time, place, and faith there. I've been steeped in religious conservatism from birth. A lot of the people I know and love, I would fall under the umbrella of what we today call Christian nationalism. So the impetus towards a highly political far-right version of Christianity, seeking to conquer the world, didn't actually come from my pastor father. It came from the classical Christian school where I went to middle and high school. It's a great education model, and it has also been weighed down with some additional baggage, and in particularly politically oriented Christian circles, classical Christian education has become a prized thing because of that. And in a lot of ways, the classical system is wonderful, but it's always something I feel I have to explain that, yes, I was raised in this, but oddly, it was not my pastor father. At school, we were taught that we were special, that the world was fallen and in disrepair, and that we could redeem it. We were taught that America was a Christian nation which had drifted off course, and that a faithful generation could restore it. As often happens with children raised to see the world a certain way, I grew up, put off childish things, and came to see the world in a different way entirely. I left Nashville behind, I left evangelicalism, I left conservatism. Not with any animus, I just moved out west, built a life for myself, and built a community of my own instead of the one I was raised in. And I then spent about a decade not thinking much about the community I came from. The way I saw it, they were the fringe, and I had moved closer to the mainstream. And I think wrongly, I ended up writing them off a little bit because of that. And then there was a Wednesday in January 2021 when I turned on the television, and I saw them on the mall and on the steps of the Capitol. I saw an Appeal to Heaven flag. I saw multiple life-size crosses carried through the crowd. One of them ended up stationed near the gallows that the crowd erected, with which they intended to execute elected officials. As a child, I was taught to look forward to the time when the armies of Christ would take back the country for God. And then I saw it on TV, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. In the 3 years since then, Christian nationalism has become a kind of vague buzzword, right? It's bandied about. There's not a particularly good definition in terms of how it's used in popular media, popular imagination. And there's also become a discussion around it. Some have attempted to minimize it as nothing. There's a quite popular Heritage Foundation article claiming that it is a smear against conservative Christians. Other folks have claimed that it is, in fact, a pressing threat to the preservation of the republic that we have. Having spent the first half of my life steeped in Christian nationalism, the large part of the second half, studying, analyzing, and working against extremist movements, I side firmly with the people who believe that it is a pressing threat to democracy. And that's not just because of what it currently is. It's because of what it's on its way to becoming. So, instead of bandying about buzzword with vague definitions, let's talk about what Christian nationalism means, who it is, who it applies to, etc. First things first, it's not new. It's not distinctly American. It's not even distinctly Christian. Christian nationalism is an embodiment, a subset of religious nationalism, which is a broader phenomenon that has occurred in many times, places, and faiths. The example I think of frequently is India, the largest democracy on earth, pressing threat in India right now is not Christian nationalism, it's Hindutva, it's Hindu nationalism. The ruling Bharatiya Janata Party has, for many years now, embraced an ideology that essentially equates being Hindu and being Indian. It says India is a nation for Hindus. There are more than 200 million Muslims in India. It's a democracy and they're equal citizens as well. And this prizing of Hinduism, the Hindutva ideology, by a party that has used it for its political clout, has led to increasing recriminations against the non-Hindu population, increasing danger. There has even been legislation in recent years to strip large portions of the Muslim population in India of their citizenship. That is not an entirely different ideology than what we're dealing with. It is manifest in a different democracy, so it has different peculiars, and it is manifest from a different faith, so it has different peculiars. But it's religious nationalism nonetheless. In the United States, Christian nationalism is an attempt to merge American identity with Christian identity. I think that is the simplest, most straightforward way to put it. It is not meant to cast aspersions. It is doing its best to hew close to the political science literature, which seeks to understand and determine, various subsets and factions within our political life. Like Hindutva attempts to define being Indian as being Hindu, Christian nationalism seeks to make being American effectively synonymous with being Christian. It's also different in our current inclination than it has been in other places of a Christian faith. In South Africa, the party that implemented and oversaw the apartheid regime for multiple decades styled itself as a Christian nationalism. In 1942, South African Prime Minister B.J. Vorster said, "We call it Christian nationalism." In Italy, they call it fascism. In Germany, they call it National Socialism. In South Africa, we call it Christian nationalism. He thought that was a banger of a line. He did not mean that as a bad thing. He thought that was good. It was, at the very least, clear. So, the problem is not Christianity. I want to be perfectly clear about that. My father is a Christian pastor. The problem is ultranationalism. It is when ideologues attempt to forcibly define what people a nation is and is not for. That is the problem. Religion is a tool that certain movements employ towards that end because it has a special place in a lot of people's lives. If you can activate that for political purposes, that works for you quite well. It's been demonstrated over and over. Because of this, it's less accurate to think of Christian nationalism as an ideology or a coherent belief system. Again, not meant disparagingly, I will get into that. But it's a movement. It is a joint venture between religious and political actors seeking power. It is a marriage between the sacred and profane with hoped for mutual benefits. The political actors believe that their embrace of religion will provide a constituency to bring them to power. The religious actors believe that having friends in power will empower them as well and protect them from perceived persecution. Sociologist and scholar of Christian nationalism Andrew Whitehead frames Christian nationalism as, quote, a political theology, which I think is quite good, used by a social movement to, quote, baptize their political ends with the support of the transcendent, which again, I think is quite well put. Whitehead had a book out last year named Taking Back America for God. Highly recommend. Most Christian nationalists don't apply the label to themselves. I think that's an important and fair thing to point out. It's not one of those things that folks are mostly running around saying, this is what I am. Despite that, the movement is real, and it is a prominent portion of American life, American political life in terms of numbers. Organizations like the Public Religion Research Institute have gone to great lengths to study, quantify, and categorize Christian nationalist beliefs in order to better understand this phenomenon. In February 2023, so 11 months ago, PRRI estimated that roughly 1 in 5 American adults adhere to a Christian nationalist worldview, and that more than half of Republicans either adhered to or were sympathetic to Christian nationalism. So again, that's about 1 in 5, it's about 20% of the population, a little more than 50% of the Republican population. Here's where it gets interesting. Not all Christian nationalists believe the same thing, especially on the Christian side of the equation. You would think that that would be where there would be a good deal. It's one book. Sorry, my dad hates that joke. So what is 64, something, never mind. There are Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, non-denominational charismatics, shout out. And some are even Catholic, though statistically the majority are not. Their theological backgrounds vary widely to the extent that it has only been a couple of centuries since some of these groups were killing each other. I think of the Huguenots in France under Catholic persecution. A lot of folks' ancestors would be rolling over in their graves now. To see you all getting along is what I mean. Despite that long history of differences between these faith traditions, these modern denominations have coalesced around a political view that is ostensibly rooted in their faiths, which are in their peculiars quite different from one another. The reason for that is because of what we know from research that Christian nationalists do have in common, which is that they are overwhelmingly white, evangelical, and Republican. Again, shout out. So what they're embracing in Christian nationalism is not this ideology that says we need to do X, Y, Z for X, Y. There's a little bit of that. But what they're really embracing is an identity, not an ideology. It is an identity. It is that being American is being Christian is being an American. And so that makes me more American. Despite the theological differences and despite the movement being more of a white ethnocultural phenomenon than a consistent ideology, Christian nationalists in America do share a set of underpinning beliefs. One, that America is, quote, a Christian nation. That's a very common belief. And the other is that Christians in America are being persecuted. I'm here to tell you that neither of those is true. Both are believed ardently. The Treaty of Tripoli, signed in 1791, 1789, one of those, signed by many people who signed the founding documents, states with the line, being that the United States is in no way a Christian nation. So we can put that one to bed pretty quickly. What's interesting, sorry, I lost my place in my notes. So the bigger one to deal with here is the idea that Christians are being persecuted and want laws based more on the Bible than on democracy and the will of the people. According to a 2022 Pew survey, 81% of white evangelical Protestants believe that, quote, this is the language from the poll, the founders originally intended the United States to be a Christian nation. And that, quote, again, the language from the poll, the United States should be a Christian nation. Both of those hit 81% amongst white evangelical Protestants in a 2022 Pew survey. That same survey showed that 65% of white evangelical Protestants believe that the Bible should have more influence on the making of laws than the will of the people. Again, 65% of white evangelical Protestants believe that the Bible should trump voters in making laws. That is, I would describe as contrary to my belief system. So, on the other bit, belief in persecution, a study by the Brookings Institution and PRRI shows that a majority of American Christians believe that they are persecuted. The last Congress, meanwhile, was 88.1% composed of self-identified Christians, leaving some doubt as to who is doing all of the persecuting. Fun little side note that I feel compelled to mention. Every time I have to cite the Brookings Institution, Richard Nixon, on the Nixon tapes, tried to convince his aides during a lot of the Watergate scandal to firebomb the Brookings Institution, which is just like the most milquetoast think tank in America. So it's kind of a funny little, Google it. So they don't make them like Nixon anymore. Nixon was very smart. All right. So this is an important bit. Not all American Christians share the beliefs underpinning Christian nationalism. Most don't, in fact. This is an extremely enlightening bit from that Pew survey when you get to the crosstabs here. The same one that found 65% of white evangelical Protestants want the Bible to play a more prominent role in lawmaking than the will of the people. So 65% amongst white evangelical Protestants. Only 38% of all Christians in that survey responded that same way. So the majority, rather that is a minority view amongst all Christians surveyed, but it is a majority view and 1 point shy of a supermajority view amongst white evangelical Protestants that the Bible should play a more prominent role in the making of laws than the will of the people. That is, not to split this hair, definitionally undemocratic. and some cause for concern. But again, 38% amongst all Christians, not 65%. Also importantly, various Christian organizations have played a prominent role in leading the charge against Christian nationalism. Christianity Today magazine has basically sacrificed itself on this altar. It is hurting their circulation. Evangelical leaders have signed open letters condemning them because they dared stand up and say, this is not our faith. This is a perversion of our faith for political ends. Another one that kind of surprised me, because where I'm from, we only have Southern Baptists. The Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty is a huge player here. I admittedly had not been familiar with them before I fell into all of this. And what I learned from them and from their executive director, Amanda Tyler, Baptists believe that religious liberty is a ye olde Baptist tradition going back a few hundred years, and they don't intend on letting go of that. So the BJC, as they call themselves, the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, has been a very prominent spokes entity pushing back on Christian nationalism. And the reason for that, Amanda Tyler says, again, executive director, she says, we're concerned not only about the threat of Christian nationalism to American democracy, but its threat to Christianity. Christian nationalism, Tyler said, which merges political and religious authority, can quickly lead to idolatry and a confusion of allegiance. She's a Bible-believing Christian. That is her position on Christian nationalism. All right, here's y'all's moment, right? The threat of Christian nationalism is not a vague, faraway thing of concern only as it manifests in national politics. In fact, Colorado is required to contend with the movement on a more regular basis than many other states, thanks in large part to the prominent outposts of Christian nationalism based in El Paso and Teller counties. Focus on the Family, James Dobson, Andrew Womack Ministries, Charis Bible College, and many others. Sorry for that listing order. I don't know if Dobson first is offensive or not. Who knows? But that guy's still around, right? Dobson, he's got to be literally 100. He's got to be out there. All right. James Dobson is somebody I thought about a lot more frequently under the age of 12 than after it. All right. So there is a small but powerful sector of the Front Range economy that is built on selling this ideology. Just go down the hill a little bit, right? Large part of northern El Paso County is really built around the Christian industry. And business is, in fact, booming. In 2020, the most recent year for which it has released tax documents, AWMI, Andrew Womack Ministries, reported more than $48 million in contributions for the year. That's not bad revenue. So all that to say, defining Christian nationalists is both sticky and pretty straightforward. Sticky because at the end of the day, they actually believe an enormous amount of different things religiously. But then, according to all of the data, both demographically, ethnographically, and in their political inclinations, they dovetail into this vision. So it is actually a fairly ecumenical movement, which is at the very least interesting. So what is it that they want now that we have a better idea of who they are? They want Leave It to Beaver. They want a white, patriarchal, and heteronormative country, and that is not just me saying it. Once again, this is borne out by a good deal of polling. PRRI's extensive research in 2023 showed a series of strong correlations between Christian nationalism and anti-Black racism and traditional patriarchal gender roles. So here's the data. According to PRRI, 85% of Christian nationalists, 85%, believe that discrimination against white Americans is as big of a problem as discrimination against Black Americans. 85%. Another 70% of Christian nationalists this one's 83, 70 is the next one. 83% of Christian nationalists disagree that generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for Black Americans to work their way out of the lower class. So 85% agree that anti-white racism is absolutely equivalent to anti-Black racism in terms of its scale, the scale of the problem in the country. 83% believe that our long storied history of institutional racism has no lasting effects. Another 70% believe that a wife should submit to a husband's leadership. That would have gotten my dad killed. Me too. And lastly, from the PRI data there, 66% of Christian nationalists believe that, quote, society as a whole has become too soft for them. I know, right? That has always struck me as a somewhat funny concern. Define it. So, by prioritizing a specific ethno-religious identity, these beliefs are fundamentally opposed to the idea of a pluralistic, multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian society in which people are free to believe and identify as they wish. They are beliefs indicative of a desire, as Yale scholar Philip Gorski put it, to, quote, restore and privilege the myths, value, identity, and authority of a particular ethnocultural tribe. These beliefs, according to Gorski, quote, add up to a political vision that privileges the tribe and seeks to put other tribes in their proper place. Like any movement, Christian nationalism is not static. While its current incarnation, as we've discussed, is already a threat to our shared democratic principles, the trend line it's following, the thing that this jumble of identities and grievances threatens to evolve into, is a threat to democracy itself. Some have called this post-liberalism, political Protestantism. The term that I prefer actually comes from Catholic teaching, even though, like we discussed, most Christian nationalists in America are not Catholics. But the Catholics have a teaching of integralism. This became a thing, I want to say Pope Pius X, maybe early 20th century, fighting over it. They had just lost the Papal States, which was most of the Pope's remaining kingdom on earth, and now they're down in Vatican City. So there was this period of Catholic social teachings where the popes are basically like, what if God said I'm supposed to be king? Just sort of doing how can we get our land and all that. So it was a political thing. There was a lot of turmoil. This was when Italy was coming into being as a country, and integralism emerged from Catholic teaching in that time. In the last decade or so, it has seen a resurgence. Integralism, post-liberalism, these are not exactly the same thing. They're not synonyms, but they are siblings. But they do share something important in common. They are undemocratic. And I do not mean that as a value judgment. I mean it literally. Large swaths of the conservative intelligentsia have set their sights on a future political system in which the obstacle of democracy will be removed. Christian nationalists have a vision for the America they want. The problem, as they increasingly see it, is that the majority of voters do not agree with them. Rather than turning their backs on that vision, which they see as divinely appointed, Christian nationalists are set to turn their backs on democracy. The willingness to do so was made undeniable on January 6th, but the lack of logistics and foresight doomed the effort, something we've seen since January 6th. At that time, there was still an importance of lip service to democracy, hence the need to claim that the election was stolen, not just bad and I don't like it. It was stolen. Interestingly, that belief has declined in Republican polling over the last 3 years, while support for the insurrection itself has continued to rise. So there's not even, in fact, as much of a pretense that it was stolen, but more and more Republican voters surveyed in polls are like, that was fine anyway. Let's talk about some specific ones. So there's this belief becoming increasingly accepted in Christian nationalist circles that their vision will not become a reality without a strong man to make it one. In 2016, Southern Baptist pastor Robert Jeffress made this explicit, saying that the government's purpose is to be, quote, a strong man to protect its citizens against evildoers. I believe that's biblical, is what he said. The influential conservative legal scholar Adrian Vermeule has spent years advocating for the integration of church and state, what is meant by integralism, by the way, and proselytizing for a future in which the state operates based on religious values. He promotes a strategy by which, quote, non-liberal actors strategically locate themselves within liberal institutions and work to undo liberalism of the state from within. By liberalism, I didn't want to quote too much Vermeule in this piece because I wanted you to read to the end, but by liberalism, Vermeule means small L, not like woke, he means like voting. Important to note here, Adrian Vermeule is not a fringe figure. He is a Harvard Law School professor. He is one of the most esteemed right-wing legal scholars, and he is also the most prominent current theorist of integralism. Vermeule's belief or vision is not just for one in which non-liberal actors strategically locate themselves within liberal institutions to work to undo them from the inside. He envisions the final state of this being a civilization in which the government governs baptized and non-baptized citizens differently. He has been explicit about it. He's not kidding around. And this is a real legal scholar. So it's not a faraway prospect. The lights on the control panel are, in fact, already flashing red. A 2022 study found that roughly 1/3 of Americans supported the idea of, quote, a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Congress or elections. That is a belief already held by more than 1/3 of American adults. Doesn't have to bother with Congress or elections. An October 2023 poll by the University of Virginia Center for Politics showed that a large portion of respondents were open to the idea of exploring, quote, alternatives to democracy in order to, quote, ensure stability and progress. Millions and millions of American adults have marched very, very close to the line of explicitly rejecting democratic principles. According to the Democracy Fund, the situation is actually even more dire. Theirs is a little bit less partisan and should make all of us feel a little bit worse. Democracy Fund earlier this month, it was like January 4th, 2024, released findings showing that only 27% of Americans consistently and uniformly support democratic norms. They did a massive survey regimen over the course of several years, and that was their conclusion. Amongst that 27% of consistently and uniformly supporting democratic norms, 45%, it's 45% of Democrats, only 13% of Republicans. If Christian nationalists were to take power, what's to say they would ever give it back? And if they are told wrongly that the choice is between God and democracy, why would they choose democracy? The threat is real. Christian nationalism, a palpable force in American politics, is well on its way to becoming an openly anti-democratic political movement on a scale the United States has never seen. The consequences could be dire, from self-coup to civil war. My editor gave me a little bit of grief about the term self-coup, and I insisted it was entirely self-explanatory. Was I wrong? Okay. When an elected government then seizes power for and from itself to remain in power, Fujimori in Peru in 1992, or perhaps somewhat more familiarly, the NSDAP, the Nazi Party in Germany after 1936 when they were elected and then retained it by force. So both self-coup and civil war are legitimate possibilities, and this is according to political scientist Barbara F. Walter. She has to use the middle initial, right? She was a little bit younger. She's a giant in her field. I recommend Dr. Walter's work to everybody, but Barbara F. Walter, not Barbara Walters, says that neither is inevitable and neither is off the table. Quote, there are definitely lots of groups on the far right who want war. They are preparing for war, Walter told the Washington Post. Quote, we know the warning signs, and we know that if we strengthen our democracy, and if the Republican Party decides it's no longer going to be an ethnic faction that's trying to exclude everybody else, then our risk of civil war will disappear. Even if it doesn't come to violence. And we must hope that it doesn't. A whole host of things that we were told could never happen here are firmly within the realm of possibility. That's the thing that I am desperate to get people to understand. It truly can happen here. And at least sparing a little bit of thought for it before it does, if we are unfortunate enough for it to, is going to push you in a place of being a good deal mentally prepared. Antonio Gramsci, right, said that the old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born. This is the time of monsters. He said it like 120 years ago. Actually, he said it around that time that Italy was doing all that with the Papal States. And I think about it every day now. That and Second Coming by, is it Yeats? Falcon cannot hear the falconer, the widening gyre. Anyway, these century-old things from a time of great turmoil and upheaval keep striking me as particularly relevant. We truly are beyond the pale here. There's nobody here young enough to have grown up in an America where these were normal beliefs that are now held by more than 30% of American adults. And it is important to understand how that changes things. Donald Trump will be on the ballot this November, have no doubt. Theocracy is in fact on the move. Tens of millions of Americans are clamoring for a strongman, unencumbered by elections or Congress. We are staring down the barrel, as unrealistic as it sounds, of elections which could be the last of their kind. And we are left to face them with nothing but organizing and hope. It's too late for much else at this point. We have failed to take meaningful action during the reprieve we've been granted. Even after the threat made itself known, our leaders failed to prioritize democratic reforms. Even as red states curtailed voting rights for millions of people in the years following January 6th, our leaders failed to pass federal voting rights reform. Even as a quasi-legitimate Supreme Court stripped the bodily autonomy of half the population while descending into multiple simultaneous ethics scandals, our leaders failed to prioritize judicial reform. All we can do now is organize and hope, because we have not been given any other options. We have never been here before. There is no guarantee that we will emerge unscathed. If we do, though, if we make it through the 2024 election and the subsequent years with American democracy intact, there are hard conversations to be had about how we got here, about how to stop the republic from ever reaching a place of such precarity again, about how to make the promises of democracy real for everyone, so that future generations might not also be tempted by the promise of force. And that's what I have for you. Moderate.
Let me remind everyone, keep your questions to a minute or less. And any other kinds of comments will be kept to a minute or less. Actually,
Let's start with Richard Harris, who is the Executive Director of Truth and Liberty, everybody.
I want to first of all thank you for coming. Of course, you're I'm saying that you have gone. We're going to go on a tour of the Paris Bible College.
I'm really hoping to. It looks beautiful, yeah.
Supposed to do awesome this week. So
Thank you so much.
So just thank you when you sit down in the chair.
I'm going on a tour.
Quickly.
Actually, I'm not sure to what it is kind of on.
So,
Richard.
thank you, sir. So, Logan, I'm very, very troubled by your remarks.
Understand.
I've read you just basically read verbatim from an article that you published on Wednesday.
Yes.
And that article, as well as one that I read that was published on August 23rd last year, have a lot of things in common. And one of the things that they have in common is that you have a tendency to grab unassociated facts and link them together in ways that is not established by the evidence. Let me give you an example.
Please do.
So the first one is you said their annual industry sales $48 million in 2021.
2020, but only according to your own tax documents.
I'm not disputing the number. But what you've done, sir, you subliminally associated that number with political expenditures by annual industries, creating the impression, if I may, creating the impression that Andrew Womack, as a so-called Christian nationalist, is spending $48 million a year on that. The vast majority of that money, of course, is spent on other sections. Let me just give you a second example, and I'll ask my question.
time is up, sir. Your time is up.
I'm leading up to the question.
We don't do that. Time up.
What's time? Richard, if you have a question, I'll hear it.
Well, the moderator's saying I can't answer.
Rodney, can we give this gentleman one moment to ask a question?
All right.
Listen, I'm not trying to make anybody angry.
It's not about us. I'm just being the moderator, like I said I would be. Why?
Okay, this question. This is my question. You've associated Christian nationalism in America with apartheid in Africa, the Nazi regime in Germany, fascists in Italy, and new statists in India who are oppressing not just Muslims, but Christians there as well. what is your evidence for, I'm just going to type right here at home,
Yeah.
because that's where you are. Do you have any evidence or at all that any Hawaiian Ministries, Charis Bible College, or any of the organizations that we affiliate or associate with have ever at one time advocated racism or violence, especially political violence, in any way whatsoever?
I believe if I had asserted that they have, I would have come with receipts. I did not. What's interesting about the 40 plus million line, did anybody else hear that way? Because the context there was that business is in fact booming for Christian nationalism.
So that's what you said.
The worldview, plus sales and political expenditures would be distinctly different things, wouldn't they, Richard?
The name was Christian.
Yes, absolutely, you do. But that's not what you stood up here and said. You said that I said those were political expenditures, right? That's not correct, right? As for I have associated Christian nationalism with fascism, Nazism. That was, as a reminder, not me. That was Prime Minister B.J. Forster of South Africa, who was speaking of himself. So, certainly. No, he was speaking of Christian nationalism, not of America. It was Christian nationalism, not America, that he compared to Italian fascism, German Nazism, etc. So those are the beliefs of a man who lived his entire life as a professing and believing Christian. As to the 40 million, I do not begrudge you it. I simply would not have depicted it as political expenditures, since that simply does not make sense. These will be contributions to Andrew Womack. I chose to not do the math to bring in the Truth and Liberty money, the Charis money, or the New Life money. I think New Life's still a little bit of a secret to some folks, but didn't get into that one yet. That one's sitting on about $83 million right now, I believe. So plenty of money in the coffers, at least on the balance sheet. And yeah, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Are you comparing Christian nationalism with Hindu nationalism and Islamic nationalism?
Here, Islamism tends to manifest a little bit differently, given the region in which it is. In fact, in the last few decades, we've seen it manifest a bit more violently. I did compare Hindu nationalism and Christian nationalism because of how they're both manifesting in major democracies right now, which is with the relatively simple and broad brush stroke of to be this nationality is roughly equivalent to being this faith.
Hindu nationalism?
Yes, sir.
You comparing it to Hindu nationalism in India as you hear it?
Absolutely, as an ethno-political force, as a cultural force, absolutely.
How many Christian nationalists in America have actually gone out and killed people that were against their beliefs? Do you have a number?
Let's see. What did the count on January 6th end up being? We have at least one. That's a good question. I certainly didn't compare their lethality.
Really, what's going on in the world? I
Yeah.
support Voice of the Martyrs. They have a monthly newsletter. This month, the newsletter talks about taking nationalism into numbers like numbers of people who are self-identified as Christians that have been killed.
It has been bad.
Oh, it's terrible.
It's been bad. And look, the point there is not to say y'all are also killing people. The point is to say when a belief system that prioritizes a specific belief, when a political belief system that prioritizes a specific faith and a specific cultural identity becomes supreme in a democracy where people are supposed to be equal, they stop being treated equally pretty quickly.
I don't agree with your premise, because in America, anybody can believe anything they want. They make it
For now,
but they are not held to account militantly compared to those. And just the very word of nationalism in those countries means something to them. Your time is up. To people, they do not support. Your time is up.
To be clear, I am casting aspersions on nationalism. Albert Einstein, pretty widely agreed upon as a pretty sharp cookie. Einstein said nationalism is an infantile disease. That's the measles of mankind. It is a silly, brutish belief. And when it inflects other things, like for instance, the faith that so many people hold dear. Why would you want to get nationalism all over that? Why would you want to get politics all over that?
Why?
I don't know.
That's it.
It does seem like taking something sacred and rolling it in the mud.
Sure.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, sir.
My name is here for
Yes, sir. Mayoral candidate? Are you a mayoral candidate right now? Oh, I thought you were. Okay. God.
God, I thought I would. That's irrespective. I think I was elected for it. And that was Jim Rodden. I actually wrote it down. So it's nice. I want to say, after being intrigued with the language of national, Christian nationalism, I am German. I am not a Christian nationalist. It don't make any sense. It's a pejorative term from what I see. Listening to one black guy, he's saying it comes out of the social justice movement. And when social justice wasn't getting headway with the guy got murdered,
George Floyd.
George Floyd,
Yes, sir.
they said it wasn't getting traction. And they said, yeah, but how about Christian nationalism?
You know, that was the largest protest movement in U.S. history, right? In terms of not getting traction, I'm not sure that characterization holds.
I have personal genetics. I see your organization is called Muckrakers. That's a great thing. I saw when
My call is yes.
I saw in Super late 1890s. It lasted about a dozen years, 10 years or something. So I see what you are. It says you're around politics as your agitator. I accept that. I accept that. So my question to you is this. Most of us are familiar in the kitchen with an agitator. Right?
Yes, sir.
So my question is, you're mixing Christianity, which is the Bible, with nationalism, which is our family documents. And most Americans agree that it's the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and the Declaration. In reverse order, those are the three. So my question to you is one. Have you read both of those original founding works?
Every word.
Every word?
Every word of the original, of the founding documents of the country. Absolutely. The Bible as well, if we were curious.
Okay. So that's good. So when you're mixing up something, you're actually mixing something up. So time is up, sorry, proportions of what you're mixing. Your time is up, sorry. What's your goal? What do you want to see? Taking the documents that you've read and you understand or have agree. What do you want to accomplish up to our community? Sorry, your time is up. Time is up, sir. Your time is up. No,
I'm not entirely sure I follow the question, but it does sort of. What's nice is it does. You mentioned in the beginning there, you don't identify as a Christian nationalist. After looking it up, I believe it was 88% of Christian nationalists or white evangelical Protestants, excuse me, in here believe that America was intended to be a Christian nation, which is sort of the point you're making, right? That it was intended to be a Christian nation.
I'm not
Okay.
I saw statistics say there's more blacks and women on the belt curve of Christian nationalism than they're all whites. And that's from another guy who said Christian.
Two things. I don't know that we're saying blacks. And second, I don't know that women and whites are distinct categories. I'm not sure that's a great poll. Do we have any other questions?
Mine's going to be a little bit different. I want to bounce it down. First, admit that I remember the Lord talked about going to a mountain and fighting off people like me. I don't want to fight you. You wrote the article. You don't get a chance to answer. But I got moved. I don't get anything. All right. So, good. That's right. It's on. You wrote the article. Secondly, Womack said, you wanted to hold the Indian. I don't want to be hold the Indian. All my life, I've lived in that land. Christian, atheist, like me, the whole 9 yards. I've lived as a land. You live, you don't bother me. I live, I don't bother you. And then Womack said, first thing he's going to have is history. You're going to destroy this school in this history by still. Culture class, that's it. Right. She's going to kill me. All right. Second, so like you said. And then he said, now we want to look at science. I heard, I'm like, science? He does a damn about covalent bonds, ionic bonds, if you can help me here, particles around electrons. I heard evolution. So I'm going to try to bring in tracing science. And sorry, your time's up. Your time's up. We almost said something nasty. And that's what I'm back here. Listen, your time. Okay, I will get her your time. All right. So now we got Michael, your time. Hey, who do you think? Say first. I'm just getting started.
In an earnest attempt, before things go all the way off the rails here, to address Councilman Zuluaga's sort of question, the benefit of bringing this up and talking about it is that I want to both, frankly, like any good American should, I want to preserve a country where you can believe in practices you want, and so can I.
Number in the back.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I want to ask you, have you ever heard about a statement? Okay.
Yeah. Why do I know this name?
Yes, for the box.
Yeah, oh, Helena Blavatsky, I know, yes.
Well, the whole entire organization is a direct result of their teachings. It's new age.
It is kind of new age, yeah.
And it's going to fail. And all the Christian nationalism, all they're doing is bringing a scourge against anybody who's Christian that's going to have its all slaughtered when the New World Order kicks in. And if you don't think the New World Order is going to kick in or insane, get ready to go to a one world government. And the Constitution is going to be flourished. It's getting already passed. And this movement, to me, is completely up the devil. It's up the devil. And it's a scourge to the body of Christ. And to anybody who's a Christian. That's the question. I did. I wanted to know if everybody was aware. And if you're not, you're going to find out that Andrew Womack's mentor was Kenneth Copeland, whose mentor was Oral Roberts, whose Oral Roberts' mentor was William Branham, who was a Ku Klux Klansman. Thank you, sir.
I will I will need to read into the connections between word faith theology and theosophy, which was Blavatsky's movement. There is actually an interesting parallel there in that out of theosophy, the movement started by Helena Blavatsky in the late 19th century, eventually rose a woman named Savitri Devi, who ended up taking, she was Greek, and she ended up taking Nazi ideology to India, and because it was the birthplace of the swastika, all this sort of stuff, and contributed to the development of an organization known as the RSS, the I can never remember what it stands for. The RSS ended up creating the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, the Hindu Nationalist Party of India at this moment. So that is an interesting little connection, but I'll have to do some reading there. So with the general,
then the one in the purple next.
Yes, sir.
But I think arguably that's a very good argument that very leader of the free world, maybe the Roman Empire would be something that before its day, only we didn't conquer the whole world by force. We didn't like freedom. But my question to you would be, by your definition and understanding of what national or Christian nationalists to be, in the mention of the documents of our family fathers and traditional 13 colonies, would they follow your definition of being a Christian nationalist?
Many of them would, yeah.
3 cases.
There were certainly a lot. There was a diversity of belief amongst the founders. If they had wanted to create an explicitly Christian nation, I have every faith that they could have done that. They did not choose to, despite many of them being professing. They were not all, in fact, professing. And the faith held by many of them was also not something that we would necessarily recognize as Christianity today. Deism was extremely big in the age, where you get the Jefferson Bible, etc. So there was, in fact, a good deal of Christian belief there. I would genuinely be fascinated to hear what scholars like Gorski and Andrew Whitehead and others would say to that question, because I think it's a very legitimate question. My first blush answer is yes.
Great. However, many people are dying to come here. I don't get to our country because of what it stands for, because of the freedom of the script. So my second question is kind of echoing Robert's question. What would you oppose your advocate? You're bringing up this idea that this is not a good thing according to what would be a good thing for you?
Freedom of religion being maintained. Look, and I truly don't want to be glib here. Freedom of religion is important. Religion is important. It is important to so many people. There has not been arguably a more prominent force in Western civilization than Christianity. Nobody can take that away, right? And you could theoretically say that, in fact, it was the Roman Empire and Constantine's conversion and forcible conversion of the citizens of the Roman Empire as a result was perhaps somewhat more influential. But Christianity has had an enormous impact on the West. The Bible is the cornerstone of the Christian or of the Western literary tradition. My beef is not with Christianity in any way. My beef is with folks who would either mandate it or even privilege it in the public square. Christianity does not get to be religion number one in America. It gets to be the same as all the rest. That's the only way everybody's free to practice what they want, right? If we have this frightening New World Order vision, all this sort of stuff, if they come to massacre y'all, I will vehemently oppose that. I'll come down here with my gun, all right? Just to help stand with you, because I don't want that to happen to you. And I don't want it to happen to non-believers, and I don't want it to happen to Jews, and I don't want it to happen to Muslims, and I don't want it to happen to Hindus. I want everybody to be able to obey the dictates of their own conscience with equal protection under the law.
Okay, the lady in the purple right there. Yes, ma'am.
I didn't have a question. I wanted to ask that people stick to the program and ask questions and not give a sermon or their own opinions first. If it's part of the question, fine, but make it brief and keep it to 1 minute rather than people coming and having these here.
Thank you. I may be the only person here that's ordained to give sermons today.
Thank you.
By a recognized actual seminary. Yes, sir.
It was pretty good.
So what I want to do is I want to appeal to all of you. Like, I have not let this man be successful.
I'm not sure I'm the one who did that. I recall a certain gentleman saying, "We ought to take over this town." Can you remind me who that was?
I have 1 minute right now. One minute, please. Please don't let this outsider divide. I'm a Christian. I love my country. I'm not your enemy. I love you all, and I don't want you to let me success.
Actually, this is a good segue. So the insider-outsider thing is actually pretty fundamental to a lot of right-wing, far-right-wing movements and to Christian nationalism itself. It's kind of inherent in the project, right? If you want to merge American identity and Christian identity, you are attempting to define outsiders. That's actually fundamental to the entire project. I'm not necessarily surprised to see it manifest here. I have no intention of dividing this town. I love Woodland Park. It's a beautiful little town. And I don't think any of us would be here if Andrew Womack had not stood up and said, let's take over this town. None of us. No, real question here. Do you earnestly believe we would be here if he had not said that? Do you think we're just here to oppose his great ministry, not defend our own?
Why did that let a fellow citizen speak? I don't understand.
Let's give him a minute.
It's entitled to speak as you are, but you try to separate out a Christian. Possibly, I can't talk.
It's not the point, sir.
Remember, we identified a belief in self-persecution, and yes, that was one of the identifying.
What my answer is, yes, the Christians are entitled to be involved in the government.
Absolutely.
Anyone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like 88% of Congress.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, that's fine. Can you please give me 3 examples for Christianity that legally force upon someone who doesn't want to practice?
Oh, certainly, and I have not alleged that that is a thing that is happening yet. No. I would have written an entirely different column if that's a thing that was happening. It's certainly a thing that some folks would like to see happen, like, for instance, legal scholar Adrian Vermeulen. So remember, there's this whole transition in here where I said, it's bad now, but it's headed towards something worse. That's the something worse. And we're specifically not there yet. I hope that is a relief. Kimbria, how you doing? Good.
I'd like to know how to respond to some of the victims that goes on with some of the self-proposed Christians. I'm sorry, sometimes you don't have great Christians, but I would like to know how to handle, or do you have any advice for me on how to handle these people who feel so victimized by powerful, engaged, empowered, resourceful moms in this community?
Look, in general, when communicating across a divide, one-on-one is the best, and personal relationships are important. Something I believe firmly. In the fight against Christian nationalism, there's nothing as valuable as Christian allies. Like the Baptist Joint Committee, like Christianity Today magazine, like Pastor Saunders, right? Like many others. When there is a fundamental sort of gap between people, somebody with more shared values is able to have that conversation a little bit better. I have a lot of conversations with Christian friends who are not of the far-right persuasion, not of the nationalist persuasion. And frankly, he makes, my closest Christian friend, makes a really good translator, frankly, and helps me, I think, feel a little bit more prepared. So really prioritizing individual relationships. Y'all all live in the same town, right? Like, it was divided before I showed up here 68 minutes ago. But it doesn't have to be, and rebuilding those relationships I know is important to a lot of people. What I've learned speaking to dozens and dozens of sources in this town, friends in this town, and loved ones in this town over the last year, there are in this town a lot of self-identified Christians who are also Republican, who really wish y'all would stop turning up the temperature on everything. There is a divisive movement in this town. And it's not me. I would encourage everybody to try to come back together on a one-to-one basis, but there's also an important corollary here, which is that at a certain point, a baseless and sticky enough belief in self-persecution is something you find in narcissists, and at a certain point, you cannot reason with that. Look, you don't have to have a good relationship with everybody. I do encourage you to try. I do think that it would make everything feel better in town if folks were talking a little bit more, but it's not your job to make peace with everybody. You know what I mean?
I'm sorry, Billy.
I'm going to take it back just for a minute to my own learning. Say, learn from people and with probably our things we have in common. I have a feeling, regardless of what side we're on, we're all patriotic. I love America. I love America. And so can you help me, at least from your perspective? What's the difference between patriotism and nationalism?
You know, there is, in fact, I believe it's a Christianity Today article with exactly that as a title. It's a little bit outside of my realm of patriotism, for instance. I know can be a difficult thing to define. I would consider myself quite patriotic. I don't think that my Republican uncle would think of me the same way, but he's wrong. So, you know, it's difficult, but I think that you can be patriotic in terms of what you love about this country is our freedom of religion and our freedom of association. And I would consider it patriotic to stand firm against attempts to encroach on that.
I think I saw the gentleman in the back next to the window first, but I'll try to make sure I get the others.
Sir, while you said you want to break it, I would just like to hear your opinion on the prayers out, Bible out of school, prayers out of school. Say it, man. How do you feel about that as far as freedom of religion?
Not familiar with the First Amendment? So our founders, many of whom were, of course, people of faith, in their wisdom, decided that Congress shall make no law establishing, I ignore the next letter, or preventing the practice thereof, right? It has never been constitutional for the government to fund religion. And I think that's probably a good thing. It is also not constitutional for the government to crack down on religion by coming into your churches and burning your Bibles and saying, you can't believe this, you can't practice that. And in fact, other than attempting to stop the spread of a virulent disease, they haven't done anything like that to y'all. Freedom of religion is critical, and it should mean, again, that you can believe like you believe in your home or in your place of worship or even in public. It doesn't mean my taxpayer dollars are compelled to fund it. And that's why, for instance, these things are not in school. That is why, what was the Supreme Court case on school prayer? Does anybody remember this? It's been like 20 years. There's the one with the really funny plaintiff name. I can't quite recall this. It's like a lie. Like I've never seen that name elsewhere. But that has never been about saying like we don't like Christianity, get it out of here. That's about the use of taxpayer resources, taxpayer facilities. And again, if we are going to have a space where we can protect everybody's right to practice and believe as they want, look, I imagine y'all would not be thrilled with kids being taught the Shahada in school, right? That probably wouldn't be super chill with everybody here. And the price of not having that is also not privileging your faith in our public spaces, in our public funded spaces.
I think I saw this yellow first early, skip with the blue. Go ahead, sir. Yes. From father, all
I am also familiar with the works of David Barton.
Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of liberty, nor hinder the right to exercise their right. That's the First Amendment. So, just because it's itself a form of constitutional republic doesn't mean that it's setting up a Christian country. All of the people are Christians.
Yes, absolutely. Most of them, yes, absolutely. No, I do paying.
On the news, all the white folks, the words, the war, the other, we don't have one.
This is the. Do you walk to school or bring your lunch of political discourse, right? It is not a thing. It is not a thing that means anything. When you say we're a constitutional republic, not a democracy, you are describing two separate aspects of the same system. Democracy is the part where we vote. Nothing about democracy, and nothing about democracy implies that everything will be decided by a majority vote of the population. And in fact, only one founder prominently saw it that way, and it was Adams. So a Federalist 10, I believe, is the only place where it is discussed like that. The rest of them absolutely use the word democracy all through their writings. Jefferson, huge on democracy. All through it. The constitutional republic is the means by which we elect representatives to represent us at our higher systems of government to act on behalf of their constituency. The democracy is the part where we vote for them. We are, in fact, both a democracy and a republic. The term is democratic republic, in fact. And I know one party has the name of one of these things in it. So I understand the hesitation, but we are, in fact, a democratic republic.
The woman standing next to the film.
About Christian, I believe that free speech and democracy. I read gave a lot of criticism about Christian nationalism, which I can tell you I do not include myself in this room. I believe there might be a lot of Christians that believe in the living let live, and when I take a hold of any of these Christians actually they are part of Christian nationalism.
So one thing I had mentioned pretty early on, and it is a fair point, by the way, it is a fair point. I did mention here that most Christian nationalists do not identify themselves as Christian nationalists. This is a difficult thing in political science literature, where, for instance, in political science literature, right wing and left wing have definitions. They don't necessarily correspond to how we identify ourselves, right? Right wing is a tendency towards hierarchicalism. The left wing, it would be a tendency towards the leveling egalitarianism. There are a lot of very smart nerds who spend a lot of time working to look at voting behavior, demographics, et cetera, and figuring out what are these subgroups. And it, again, is not necessarily something you have to identify yourself as, but they have come through with fairly consistent findings that white evangelical and Protestant correspond very highly, about 78%, to the adherence of specific beliefs that America should be and was intended to be a Christian nation, and the Bible should play a more prominent role in the making of laws, and that Christians are being persecuted. That is effectively what the pollsters and political scientists and other folks who analyze this. I'm talking folks who work at universities, not campaigns, right? These are folks who are saying there's a phenomenon happening. It is our job to understand it. I have my PhD in political geography, something like that, right? Like that's who is doing this work. It's not folks saying, let's go after those Christians. Let's give them a funny new nickname. Like that's not really how it works. So it is the observation of a phenomenon, of a system of beliefs within certain cultures that really dovetail. That's what they're calling Christian nationalism. Beyond folks going and saying, I am a Christian nationalist. Very, very few folks say that, which is not equivalent to saying Christian nationalism therefore does not exist.
The woman right here.
A lot of people that are forward more
certainly, and I adversity is not the goal. The absence of it, in fact, is. And again, this didn't start when I wrote a column. This didn't start when I came to give a talk. In Woodland Park's context specifically, it did have a starting point. And nationally, had less of a defined one. It's sort of been percolating for a long time, but
I recommend the college. I know a lot of people, a whole lot. They don't look like talking about it all.
I think that's great. That's also great, and you should have the right to do that. Absolutely. And the people who don't share your belief should have the right to send their kids to a public school where they are not being taught your belief. All right, that's great. Honestly, great. My mom loves me too. Yes, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. Like, and that's a good thing. I'm very grateful for that. Like, it's not a joke. It is a joke, but it's not a joke. Like, I totally, and that's good of you. Having those spaces and the right to make those choices, like sending your kids to the private Christian school. That's why a lot of people in this town don't want the public schools. Their only other option, de facto, adopting the same curriculum, right? Like that's what they don't want is if
they were all about Christmas. They're able to train.
Your time is up, man. Your time is up, man. Your time is up. Thank you. The woman right here. Do it.
Have you ever watched more live as the American one?
that is a lot of words. I have. No, I've heard a lot of the Rescue America tour. Was it the Mike Flynn thing? I haven't heard the Flashpoint Live thing. Wonderful. That sounds great. Will y'all let me pass the gate? Will you let me pass the gate? I truly, yeah, look, seeking greater understanding is important. And the community I was raised in, for instance, down south, these things are like a little bit different, but also I was raised in a Calvinist faith tradition, which is quite different on a doctrinal level. And I'm genuinely interested in all of that. And, been attempting to genuinely better understand. It was not Andrew Wommack's theology that caught my attention. It was the political element of things, right? And trying to backfill and understand what he believes, so that we're not working on caricatures. We're working on characterizations. We're working on understanding, and we can come to a place where we can understand each other and not agree. That's fine. It's our right to do that. And in fact, everybody should get a little bit better at doing that. I think nationally, right? It's agreeing to disagree is a secret superpower in life. And that's I think what religious liberty ends up fundamentally being about, is the right to agree to disagree and to then each go practice separately. That's what we all want.
Well, you hear that way they actually said woman all guns and the criminality back.
Hi. Now speak. So, like this gentleman here noticed, right, he did mention that there are constantly democracy. So, and a question. We said that we read the Constitution, right?
I certainly have read the Constitution. Yeah.
So, in Article Section 4,
Which article?
Sorry, Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution requires that the United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government.
Yeah.
So it's a Republican form.
That's the part where we represent people. The democracy part is where we vote for them.
No. Well, and you mentioned John Adams, right?
Yes.
Okay. So John Adams also quoted, "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exalts, and murders itself."
Right. Adams was the only. Yes, ma'am.
It says also that there never was a democracy that didn't.
Adams again.
This is what our political Jackie Dalhart goes over democracy when we are Republican. So that was my question to me. Yeah, you understand. So
I can absolutely comment on that. I am sure we all have better things to do than do we're a republic, not a democracy over and over, right? It is important, and I wish that it was more broadly understood, that we are in fact both. This is not in fact up for debate. This is a thing that only exists because of Facebook, right? Like, no, there are not serious people out there particularly confused about this. They refer to different parts of the same system. We are absolutely a republic. We are also a democracy. It is a democratic republic. Like, I encourage everybody to read this. And again, what I mentioned earlier about Adams was alone amongst the founders in his view of democracy as always meaning 50% plus one deciding everything. It was a severely minority view amongst the founders. I would encourage you to read Jefferson. I would encourage you to read Franklin. Those dudes were huge on democracy. And there are, in fact, recorded conversations from the Constitutional Convention of these guys disagreeing with Adams about what democracy is. It's just extremely well documented. Any other questions?
one thing I have to say, I would say I think we like stuff because they some people look at Christian Nationalism, but it doesn't find it to categories.
Sure.
The thing is, you kind of, I won't comment that, I misspoke you. It sounded like this thing, as Christians, they're not allowed to use the Bible kind of resource.
Oh, yeah.
And say, this is how we want to product, this is how we want to play ball.
No.
Every person, whether they're a believer or not, when they do have something that they use to have a moral compass,
Yeah.
come to a decision when we're voting something, this is what I want. I personally, I will always use my faith as one of those factors to come at condition. What is the right way, in your opinion, for me as a Christian to be active in the faith, to be politically active in standing for what I believe is right?
It sounds like you're doing it. Look, for everybody to vote according to the dictates of their own conscience is what we want to protect. And if you believe in something firmly, look, growing up in the church, and despite having left the church, I still hold this level of folks who profess something really strongly, right, and then don't act according to it, don't vote according to it. That really still really kind of sticks in my craw. So I would encourage all of you to be letting your beliefs inform your votes. You should be doing that. It is what it means to be an earnest believer. It is what it means to be an earnest participant in the voting process. Where we hit a difference, and the way that a lot of this phrasing was in those PRRI and Pew polls, is about what should matter more ultimately when it comes to the determination of what the laws of the land are. I believe that the laws of the land should be what people decide they should be through our Republican system in which we democratically engage. And that's what it is. I really, y'all are so welcome to do that. And I truly encourage you to do that. And if you were a majority amongst the American voting population, I would also be in support of us then moving in your direction, right? Because that's democratic. It doesn't mean that you can't end up being majority and we can't then do your thing. But we can't do it because somehow Americanism and Christianity are synonymous or are privileging one another. We have to do it because it was the will of the people. That is what is specifically disagreed with in a lot of these polls, saying that the Bible, because it is the Bible, should have a more prominent role in the determination of laws. I can understand somebody feeling that way. I think that it is also inherently undemocratic, right? Because it is specifically prioritizing that over the will of the people. And that's what I think is an important red line.
It only, no, I thought, majority.
Oh, is it? Well, that's the will of the people. Yes. Yes, you're right. Yeah, absolutely. If the will of the people was, in fact, that we should have more biblically based laws, that's the will of the people. That's how democracy works.
Randall, back.
Yeah, you bring in some of the suppression history that you current would like to suppressing or something along those lines. Am I correct?
I think a reference probably to the American birthright studies or standards in which there's a certain different version of American history being taught.
Okay, then my question is they get the burden of Black history being taught, but it's just a burden that keeps Black people as the image of the fact that we talk about slavery, but we don't talk about the progress that Black people made after the Emancipation Proclamation. That 70% of the Black people were illiterate or after during the Emancipation Proclamation for 40 years. They were 70% became literate.
That's amazing.
Absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
For 1950, about 50s and 60s, that Black people, that 80% of Black people in our families were 2%. One part of, and now I don't see that talk in history.
No, yeah, I don't either.
I see oppression, I see systemic racism, which I don't believe is systemic racism. Come on. I don't believe in institutional racism. As a Black person, I've seen racism, I've seen pockets of it, but I don't believe that's systemic. I don't believe that's institutional. I believe that's wrong.
Sure.
So, what?
I'll hear about
My question, how can we see Black people be brought so that all of that is encompassed? The progress that we made.
Honestly, that's a great question, and I would. A lot about the way we teach history is really bad. Some folks decide. I mean, yeah, like forget the American birthright stuff, right? Even what it was replacing was not what we could have been achieving, right? Our state standards are better than American birthright and lower than they probably would have been decades ago. I think that what we see with a lot of history education is that a certain meta narrative was established like 100 years ago, and over the course, and you have these blocks, right? So what has always struck me as a weird omission is that virtually all American history courses go Civil War. There was a thing called Reconstruction. We're not going to talk about it. World War I. That's how it goes, right? Whereas Reconstruction saw the first dozens of elected Black Congress people. It saw massive political expansion of power for Black Americans after freedom. And that's just a story we don't tell. And it's something that, because we don't tell it, folks don't know it. We can't end up with this more full version of ourselves. We don't talk about, for instance, even when talking about slavery, we don't talk about Nat Turner. We don't talk about slaves taking things into their own hands. We don't talk about self-emancipation. I think that is broadly because we're pretty bad at teaching history. There are all sorts of other things. You should see what everybody is being taught about the Cold War. It's crazy, right? Like, history has been boiled down, particularly in these lower schooling levels, to a series of stories and a series of test answers that have to be filled out about them. I don't think it particularly serves anybody particularly well. And frankly, I think that's probably a broader problem with the education system that I wish I knew how to fix, but that I have this real conviction that different history lessons yield different people. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm an educator, so I'm just wondering if I could pop in and respond to your question. I've been an educator for 29 years. I spent 17 years in Woodland Park and amongst my family situation. And now I work in a school that is predominantly Latino and Black American. So I've had to get a radically different experience. But to answer your question, sorry, I'd say one of the biggest reasons that history is not taught well in this country is that we have white history and we have other history.
Yeah, there's
and one
that.
of the problems is that we have American history. So we feel that we have to separate parts of history. We have Black History Month, which is much better than what we used to have if you research why we have it as a month now. We are all Americans in this country, or becoming so in some cases. So why are we taking only 1 month to recognize our brothers and sisters who are part of our entire population? We are all in this together. And we all need to be recognized as wonderful things that we so accountable for those things that were not good, so that we choose not to do that to each other.
Look, yes. History is critical. History is critical. And for instance, one thing that I wish was more broadly understood about, whether y'all identify it as not, amongst folks who the literature is going to call Christian nationalists, is the history of persecution that Christians have gone through. And I don't mean Rome and the lions, Huguenots and the Catholics in France 200 years ago, right? 250 years ago. Not that long. You have been at the end of the gun, at the bottom of the boot, for other kinds of Christianity that have decided that they can capture the government, they're the only way it can be, and they have killed your forebears. For the difference between consubstantiation and transubstantiation, they killed thousands. Why would you want that? Isn't it better to have a government that does not prize specific religious doctrines and then uses them against people who have different religious doctrines? Isn't it better that the Huguenots were not murdered for believing in consubstantiation instead of transubstantiation, which maybe I'm just a Protestant, but has always seemed a little kooky to me? Like, it's clearly still a cracker, folks. And people were killed over it. And that is not to say Catholicism bad or anything. It's to say that happened because there was enormous religious influence and control over government. And it was used for power, and it was used to oppress people with beliefs much more like yours than like the Christians, the version of Christians who were in government at the time. So it's, yeah.
Yes, this man here, named Gail.
See if you're in the Christian nationalist movements, besides arguments on that.
Yeah, so the one that I actually think is really interesting is it's like the most explicit on the nose you can get. So the rise of Mussolini in Italy happens at the same time that Pius XI is Pope. Pius XII was the real severe looking one who was Pope through World War II and kind of like messed all that up. It was not great. So if you've heard of a bad Pius around fascism, this is actually the guy before him. Mussolini was rising to power, originally democratically elected. That was an auto coup. They ended up dismissing all the members of the Italian parliament who were not fascists after an assassination attempt. And then you're a dictator, right? So the church had lost a lot of its temporal power and holdings in the decades preceding that. and really wanted authority over the government. So Pius the 11th was the second pope to rule in a Rome that he didn't control. It was the first one to where Rome was the capital of somebody else's country, the second one. He wanted temporal authority back that had been his predecessors. Mussolini wanted a lot of authority as well and was doing it in a country that at that time was 95% Catholic. Those guys worked out a deal, and it went really well for both of them until it didn't. But essentially, they truly got together in a room and decided that Mussolini, who originally was anti-clerical, this had been a thing in the very beginning of Italian fascism, was anti-clericalism. When he first came into power, they removed all the Catholic holidays from the calendar, and then within like a year, he was like putting all those back on. What's actually funny about this, he thought they were all on Sunday. That's how like not a Catholic he was. Mussolini thought all of the Catholic holidays were on Sunday, so when he agreed to put them all back on, he was like, this won't be a problem. And there was a little miffed when they were on like Tuesdays or whatever. But that I always think of as the most explicit example, because the Catholic Church, the Pope had recently, it wasn't the same Pope, but the papacy had recently lost a lot of temporal power. Mussolini wanted to bank the spiritual power so that he could rise to prominence in a nation that overwhelmingly, far more than in America today, had the same doctrines and beliefs. So that's the one where it's like the simplest, most straightforward bargain that they made. Mussolini put all those calendars back on the holiday and started being like, Pope good. You know, like it wasn't even like super high effort. And they'd have occasional meetings. And then he also granted papal nuncios and envoys of Vatican City greater power as diplomats, as political actors, and accepted lists from Pius XI folks to appoint to political office. So it just truly worked for both of them. That's what I think of it as like the simplest version.
Last question, right here.
Well, first I want to thank you. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I found it very depressing, actually.
Me too.
My question is, our school board has been influenced strongly by both politics and religion. And our community is split on that issue. It is probably a mountain that has been conquered. What would you suggest for the citizens, myself, for example, I've been to 46 years? What can we do to educate all of the people who have been here many, many years to preserve the independence of politics and religion that we have had? And now it's being also threatened in our city government.
This is, as my last answer, I will give you the most hackneyed and cliched one, and the one that I believe by far most deeply. Coming together around the things that you can believe in common, building community, talking about what some of these groups have done on Facebook, Nat and them, is building community is the way that you counteract disruptions in community. Through, for instance, the first attempt at school board recalls, I knew a lot of people who otherwise had not really known each other came together and are all sitting together over there now. It is easy to fight. It is hard to build. But building is not only the best defense for a community or value or place that you love, it's also really rewarding. And for instance, I would have loved all the Karis turnout with perhaps, I don't want to say better intentions, but if we're all being honest here, not casting aspersions, you didn't come to listen, you came to talk. And I'm glad that we had those conversations, but it's not necessarily in the spirit that we're talking about when we talk about bridging gaps, building community, etc. I think there is a gotcha. I think there is, there's an us versus them that y'all brought into this room, and that I think we've handled well enough that I would encourage you to rethink. And I would encourage you, Richard, to rethink it. Let's talk, man. Let's talk. I would love to, in fact. I do need to get out of town ahead of the storm, but I would actually, in fact, love to find times to talk. Yes, sir. You can make friends in places you don't expect. And I know this is This is Barney. This is Sesame Street. I learned everything worth knowing on Sesame Street, right? And I said, wait, truly, there are bad things out there. And I know from working in politics, working in journalism, that the urge is to like, let's go find that bad thing and fight it, right? And there's always another bad thing to fight, and you get tired and you get exhausted and it hurts and it burns down your soul. And the only thing I've ever found that pours back into that is building something, not going to fight something, not going to defeat something, but creating something that will in its own time defeat that other thing passively, right? Through the creation of something on shared values, shared relationships. You're all people, right? Again, I know it's Barney stuff, but you're all people. And I think to a certain extent, the factions in this room stopped seeing each other in the fullness of their humanity quite a while ago. And I don't think any of y'all are enjoying that, right? I truly think that a little kumbaya goes a long way when it comes to sharing a small town. I really do. So, look, new community groups, new times for people to come together. I think those things genuinely matter. I think you can build new bonds over the ones that have been frayed. And I think that that's how you long-term give this back to the community that you love and want.
That's Charles. I suspect we could go on until 6 a.m. in the morning, 6 p.m. tomorrow. But that'll be it. We've got people who are concerned about driving in the storm that's coming. So that will be it for today. Thank you.
Hey, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.